I knew something was off the moment I saw the garden hose snaking across my lawn at 7 in the morning. It was Saturday. I'd worked a double shift at the fire station, got in around 3 a.m., and was just settling in for a rare, peaceful sleep. But then came the sound, this odd gurgling like a clogged drain on steroids. I dragged myself out of bed, pulled on a pair of sweats, and followed the noise down to the basement. I hit the bottom step and froze. Water. Everywhere. My entire basement, my gym, my tools, the carpet I just installed last summer was under 3 inches of rising water. And that hose. It was jammed through the small basement window near the ground, running full blast. I yanked it out. Cold water sprayed everywhere. I ran outside, still barefoot, following the hose across my yard and straight to the neighbor's spigot. And who do I find next to it? Karen Kingsley. President of the HOA, 50-something, over bleached hair, clipboard in hand like she was born holding it. "Karen," I shouted, holding up the soaked hose like a dead snake. "What the hell is this?" She didn't even flinch. Just gave me that tight, passive-aggressive smile she'd patented since the day I moved in. "Oh, good morning, Jackson," she said sweetly. "I warned you 3 times about the color of your storm door. It violates the HOA palette. Since you refused to comply, we had to take alternative measures. You flooded my basement. It's just water," she said flatly. "Maybe next time you'll take your warning letters seriously." Now let me be clear, I never got any warning letters. Not a single one. She made that up, just like she made up the fine from last month for overgrown grass when I'd mowed it the day before. I stared at her, stunned. "You trespassed onto my property, hooked up a hose, and shoved it into my basement window because you didn't like my door color?" Karen clicked her tongue like I was the problem. "This is what happens when homeowners think they're above the rules. You're lucky I didn't report you to the board." I didn't say another word. I walked back into my house, grabbed the security camera hard drive from my porch setup, and popped it into my laptop. Sure enough, there she was, caught in glorious HD, dragging the hose across my yard, twisting it into the window and turning on the spigot, all while humming like it was just another day of gardening. I copied the footage onto a USB drive, put on a clean shirt, and drove straight to the police station. I didn't need to say much, just handed over the footage and explained the damage. The officer blinked twice, then called over his supervisor. Within 10 minutes, they were reviewing everything, taking notes, and asking for a written statement. "She's the HOA president?" the officer asked. "Yeah." "And this isn't the first time she's pulled something like this?" "Well, it's going to be her last." By the time I got home from the station, a squad car was already parked in front of Karen's house. Not a siren in sight, no lights, just quiet and methodical. An officer stood at her front door, knocking with that slow, deliberate rhythm that said, "We're not here for games." I stayed on my porch, arms crossed, watching. I didn't need to get involved again, not yet. They had everything they needed. But I wasn't going to miss the moment she realized she wasn't untouchable. Karen opened the door in a lavender robe, her reading glasses perched at the end of her nose. She looked like she'd just sat down with a chamomile tea and a copy of Neighborhood Governance Monthly. The officer introduced himself, showed his badge, then held up a printed still frame from the footage I'd provided her, hose in hand, caught mid-turn of the spigot, her whole body stiffened. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me." Her voice pitched up, tight with disbelief. "Excuse me, on what grounds?" "Criminal mischief, trespassing, and property damage. You were caught on video intentionally causing a flood in your neighbor's home. We've reviewed the footage and we've already contacted the district attorney's office." She started waving her arms. "This is outrageous. I'm the HOA president. I was enforcing community compliance." The officer didn't flinch. "The HOA doesn't grant you immunity from criminal charges, ma'am." I watched as she tried to argue, throwing out phrases like community standards and board authority, but nothing stuck. The moment he mentioned a warrant had already been signed by a judge, her confidence cracked. I saw it happen. Her shoulders dropped. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. They didn't cuff her in front of the neighbors. Probably a courtesy or maybe just part of protocol for non-violent charges. But she still had to get into the back of that cruiser, flanked by 2 officers, while a few curious residents peeked through blinds and hedge gaps. I went back inside and started photographing the damage. I needed everything documented for insurance, for the court, for whatever came next. The water had soaked into the drywall. The carpet was ruined. My weight bench had started to rust. The toolbox I'd inherited from my dad, half submerged, and my furnace, the one I just had cleaned, toast. I took a break around noon and drove over to the county courthouse. Building was quiet for a Saturday, but the clerk's window was still open for filings. I submitted a restraining order request and handed over a copy of the footage. The clerk didn't ask many questions after seeing the evidence. When I got back, a small group of neighbors had gathered near the sidewalk, murmuring in low tones. Carol from 2 doors down flagged me over. "Is it true?" she asked, eyes wide. "Did the police really take Karen in?" "Yeah," I said. "They did." She told the board she had the legal right to enforce compliance through corrective action, said it was in the bylaws. "It's not," I said flatly, "and even if it was, flooding someone's home isn't corrective action. It's a felony." Tom, a retired mechanic who lived across the street, nodded slowly. "You're filing charges. They already filed them. I'm just making sure it sticks." Carol bit her lip. "You think she's gonna try to come after you when she gets out?" "I already filed for a protective order," I said. "She's not setting foot on my property again." Tom let out a short whistle. "About time someone took that woman down a peg." She fined me last year for having a non-regulation mailbox. It was the same model as hers. "She told me my porch lights were aggressively luminescent," Carol muttered. We stood there for a moment, the silence saying more than words could. It was like everyone had wanted to speak up for years, but no one had dared. Now the dam had cracked, and I wasn't about to let it seal up again. By Monday morning, the news had made it to the local paper. HOA president arrested for felony vandalism in suburban dispute, the headline read. The article quoted the police report and mentioned that I'd submitted video evidence. It didn't name me directly, but anyone in the neighborhood could put 2 and 2 together. I got a call from an attorney the HOA had on retainer. His tone was polite, but I could hear the strain under it. "Mr. Blake, the board would like to resolve this matter privately. We understand there may have been a misunderstanding." "There was no misunderstanding," I replied. "Your president committed a crime. I'm not dropping anything." She may have overstepped, but the board didn't authorize her actions. "We'd like to offer full reimbursement for any damage and a public apology in exchange for withdrawing the criminal complaint." "You're a little late for that," I said. "The DA's already involved, and if you didn't authorize her, then you need to prove it. Because if I find out this was a coordinated move, I'll push for a full audit." There was a pause on the other end, just long enough to say I'd hit a nerve. "We'll be in touch," he said. "Please do. I'll be forwarding all communication to my lawyer." I hung up and sent the entire call recording legal in this state without notification to the detective assigned to the case. Then I started digging. I pulled up the most recent HOA financial disclosures. They'd been mailed out quarterly, but no one really scrutinized them. Until now, a few things stood out immediately. A $5,000 community aesthetics line item with no breakdown. Repetitive payments to a landscaping company that didn't match the actual maintenance schedule. And a strangely large legal consultation fee from the previous month right after I'd first rejected Karen's door complaint. I called up my buddy Marcus, a forensic accountant who owed me a favor from a fire we handled at his brother's warehouse last year. "Send me what you've got," he said. "I'll let you know if it's just sloppy bookkeeping or something deeper." 2 days later, he called back. "Jackson, I don't know how you're living in that neighborhood without losing your mind. That bad. Those filings aren't just shady, they're illegal. At least 3 entries look like embezzlement. Funds marked for community improvement funneled into what I'm guessing is a personal checking account, same last 4 digits repeated across 3 months. I've seen enough of these to know what it looks like. I emailed everything to the detective. Within hours, he called me personally. We're reopening the investigation to include financial misconduct. The DA's office is bringing in their white-collar crimes unit. If the HOA board was involved, they'll be looking at conspiracy charges. That night, I walked down the street and found Tom and Carol chatting near his garage. I filled them in and we started organizing. We called a community meeting. No board members invited. We held it in the park pavilion, under the string lights someone had donated last Christmas. By the end of the night, nearly 3 dozen residents showed up. We signed a petition demanding a full audit of the HOA's spending, immediate removal of any board member under investigation, and a freeze on all fines and enforcement actions until a full review could be completed. It wasn't just about Karen anymore. She'd opened the floodgate literally. Now the whole community was ready to drain the swamp. On Wednesday morning, I was halfway through replacing the drywall in the basement when I got a call from Detective Armand, the one overseeing the investigation. His first words were measured but carried weight. "We executed a search warrant on the HOA office this morning." I paused, dust mask dangling from one ear. "What did you find?" Enough to open a second case. Hard drives with financial records, several falsified invoices, and a ledger that doesn't match any bank statements. Looks like more than one board member was involved. Karen wasn't acting alone. I leaned against the wall, heart thudding in a different rhythm now. How big is it? Potential wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy to commit embezzlement. If the DA decides to pursue federal charges, we're talking serious prison time. We're coordinating with the state attorney general's office now. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need to. I just said I'd be available if they needed anything else, then hung up and stood in the silence of my half-gutted basement. By the following day, subpoenas were flying. The HOA's treasurer, a wiry guy named Dennis who always wore golf visors indoors, was taken in for questioning. Then came Sandra, the board's secretary, who'd once tried to fine a single mother for having a non-neutral color toddler swing in her backyard. Both were escorted out of their homes by plainclothes officers. The neighborhood was no longer whispering, it was roaring. That weekend, Marcus dropped by with a manila folder tucked under his arm. He didn't say anything until we were seated at my dining table. They weren't just misusing funds, they were laundering them. I stared at him. Through what? Fake vendors, landscaping companies that don't exist. Maintenance contractors that were just LLCs registered to Karen's cousin in another county. The payments were split and routed through 2 banks before landing in personal accounts. I opened the folder. Spreadsheets, printouts, and screenshots filled the pages, routing numbers, document headers, timestamp transfers. It was ironclad. "You gave this to the DA, right?" "Already sent." "They're opening a grand jury investigation." "How long until it hits the rest of the board?" Marcus tapped a document with his finger. "Depends how fast one of them flips. My guess, someone's already talking." The next morning proved him right. A statement was posted on the HOA's website, signed by Dennis. He claimed he'd been pressured by leadership to sign off on unauthorized payments and that he was fully cooperating with authorities. He named Sandra and Karen directly. The statement vanished within an hour, but not before I saved a PDF copy and forwarded it to the community email list. That night, Carol knocked on my door with a folder of her own. Inside were copies of the HOA's architectural violation complaints going back 5 years. She'd pulled them from her late husband's files he'd served briefly on the board before resigning out of frustration. "There's a pattern," she said, pointing to the dates. Every time someone pushed back against a board decision, boom, 2 weeks later they'd get hit with a violation. Sometimes for things that weren't even against the rules. I thumbed through the stack, names I recognized, Families who'd moved out in frustration, elderly couples who'd quietly paid the fines just to avoid confrontation. They were using the violations to push people out, I said. Not just that, Carol said quietly. Look at who bought those homes after. I did. And that's when it hit me. Most of the homes that had changed hands after a string of violations ended up sold to LLCs. The same 3 companies, all registered within the same 6-month window. I looked up the addresses on the county property database. 2 had since been rented out. 1 had been flipped and resold at a steep markup. They were driving people out to flip the properties, Carol nodded, and they used the fines to fund the purchases. I didn't sleep that night. I compiled everything: the documents from Carol, Marcus's financial breakdowns, Dennis's statement, and sent it all to Detective Armand, who replied within the hour. This changes everything. We're bringing in the Financial Crimes Division. By the end of the week, the HOA was effectively paralyzed. The board resigned en masse, except for one member, a quiet guy named Ruben, who'd only joined 2 months earlier and had voted against every motion since. At the next emergency community meeting, Ruben stood under the pavilion lights, holding a clipboard that wasn't shaking despite the crowd of over 60 people watching him. I've contacted the county, he said. We're dissolving the current HOA charter. There's enough evidence of fraud and abuse to justify it. If the court agrees, we'll be placed under temporary municipal oversight until we can elect a new board from scratch. Someone asked if that meant no more fines. Ruben nodded. All enforcement actions are frozen until the new charter is approved. Any fines issued in the last 3 years are being reviewed for reimbursement. If you paid one, keep your receipts. Tom raised his hand. And what about the properties they bought through those shell companies? Ruben's mouth tightened. The DA's office is freezing those assets. If they were acquired through fraud, the state has grounds to seize and auction them. Proceeds would go into a community restitution fund. The crowd murmured, then clapped. A few people even whooped. It was more than a victory, it was a purge. 2 weeks later, I got a letter from the DA's office. I'd been listed as a primary victim and key witness. They wanted me to testify before the grand jury. I agreed without hesitation. At the courthouse, I sat in a waiting room with a few other neighbors, people who'd quietly suffered for years under the HOA's thumb. One by one, we were called in. I told the truth plainly. What I saw, what I recorded, what I'd uncovered. I didn't embellish. I didn't need to. Right before I left, the assistant DA leaned in. Just so you know, the charges will include racketeering. That opens the door for federal involvement. RICO? I asked. She nodded. Karen and her associates didn't just break HOA rules. They built a criminal enterprise under the guise of community enforcement. That's organized crime. When I returned home, the atmosphere in the neighborhood had shifted completely. Kids played without their parents, nervously scanning for clipboard patrols. Mailboxes sported flags and decals that would have been fined a month ago. Porch swings creaked gently in the breeze, no longer non-compliant fixtures. People smiled without glancing over their shoulders. Carol and I walked the block that evening, quietly taking it all in. She looked toward the empty Kingsley house, now under County Leon, and shook her head. I used to think we had no choice, that the HOA was just part of living here. I nodded. Turns out we just needed someone to say no. No, she repeated, as if testing the word. It feels good. Later that week, I finished the last section of drywall in the basement. The furnace had been replaced, the carpet torn out and reinstalled, and my dad's toolbox sat cleaned and dry on a new shelf. The damage was gone, but the memory stayed, and so did the proof. The footage that started it all, the documents, the testimonies, they were all backed up, dated, labeled, and stored in 3 separate cloud drives. Not out of fear, out of principle. Because people like Karen counted on silence. They depended on people being too tired, too intimidated, too alone to fight back. She hadn't counted on a firefighter with security cameras, a forensic accountant friend, and a neighborhood on the edge of rebellion. She counted wrong. Reuben called a final town meeting just before the new board election. Not in the park this time, but in the local library auditorium, which, for the first time in the neighborhood's history, was packed wall to wall with residents. No one sat in the back rows. Everyone leaned forward, hungry for resolution. He stood at the podium with a folder of typed notes, but he didn't look down at them. "The grand jury handed down formal indictments this morning," he said. "Not just for Karen, but for Sandra, Dennis, and 2 others who were running the shell companies that bought up your neighbors' homes." A wave of murmurs rolled through the room, and he waited for them to settle. "They've been charged with racketeering, wire fraud, conspiracy, and multiple counts of financial exploitation. The DA is working with federal prosecutors to escalate the case. There will be trials." Someone near the front raised a hand. "What about the restitution fund?" Reuben nodded. "The state froze over $700,000 in assets. That includes the HOA's accounts, all homes acquired through fraud, and personal accounts tied to the fake vendors. Most of that will be returned to the community." Another voice, this time from a woman I recognized as one of the quieter residents, the type who used to avoid eye contact when walking her dog. "How did they think they'd get away with it? They didn't think anyone would push back," Reuben said. "But someone did." Every head turned toward me. I was seated near the aisle, trying to stay out of the spotlight. Still, Reuben gestured in my direction. "Jackson Blake exposed the first thread. The rest of you helped pull it until the whole thing unraveled. This wasn't one man's fight. It was all of ours." I stood only because everyone else did. The applause was awkward at first, then sincere. I gave a small nod and sat back down. My hands stayed folded. I didn't need praise. I just wanted peace. After the meeting, I stepped outside into the cool evening air. The sky was just dark enough to make the streetlights flicker on, casting long shadows across the parking lot. I heard footsteps behind me. "Carol." "They're never coming back, are they?" she asked. "No," I said. "Not as board members." "Not as neighbors." She looked relieved, but there was something else in her eyes, unfinished business. She reached into her purse and handed me a folded piece of paper. "You should see this," she said. It was a notarized statement from a former HOA employee, a junior compliance assistant, who'd quietly quit last year. In it, she described how Karen had pressured her into falsifying violation reports, backdating letters, and shredding complaints from residents who challenged the board's decisions. She also confirmed that the so-called anonymous votes used to pass certain policies were fabricated entirely. "She came forward after hearing what you did," Carol explained. "Said she was scared before, but not anymore. It was the final nail. I passed it to the DA's office the next morning." That Friday, the state sent an independent auditor to oversee the HOA's dissolution. He was a soft-spoken man in his 60s with a legal pad, a thermos of coffee, and the kind of patience that comes from decades of watching small-time tyrants fall. He interviewed every resident who'd filed a complaint in the past 5 years. He cataloged every fine issued and compared them to the bylaws. Nearly 70% were invalid. He also uncovered something none of us expected: a hidden clause buried deep in the original charter that allowed residents to petition for permanent HOA removal if over half the homeowners signed a formal repeal. Carol and I printed 50 copies of the petition that night. Within 2 days, we had the signatures. The county held a vote the following week. It passed by a landslide. The HOA was officially dissolved. No more board. No more forced compliance. No more fines for porch plants or mailbox flags. What replaced it wasn't chaos, it was community. We formed a volunteer neighborhood council, with rotating members and no authority to enforce anything beyond organizing block parties, safety patrols, and seasonal cleanups. The council held its first event 3 weeks later, a neighborhood BBQ in the lot where the old HOA office used to stand. Someone brought a grill the size of a pickup truck. Kids drew chalk murals on the pavement. Even Tom, who rarely left his garage, brought out a cooler of homemade root beer. I stood near the grill, flipping burgers when Reuben approached, plate in hand. "You're not planning on running for council, are you?" he asked. I shook my head. "I've had enough politics for one lifetime," he grinned. "Good, you'd win by a landslide and we need someone to keep the rest of us humble." A month later, I got a call from the assistant DA. The trials were moving fast. Karen had refused a plea deal, confident she could sway a jury. The others weren't so bold. Dennis flipped first, then Sandra, then one of the shell company owners. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records, emails, text messages, even audio recordings from board meetings. Karen took the stand in her own defense. It didn't go well. The footage of her flooding my basement was played in court. The jury watched it in silence. Her lawyer tried to spin it as symbolic protest. The judge interrupted him mid-sentence to clarify that felony vandalism wasn't protected expression. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty. She was sentenced to 12 years, with eligibility for parole in 6. The others received between 4 and 8, depending on their cooperation. Restitution was ordered. Community members who'd been fined unlawfully received checks over the following year. Some were small, $50 or $60. Others were substantial. Tom got back nearly $6,000. Carol's total came out to just over $9,000, including interest. I didn't take a cent. The insurance had already covered my basement, and anything else I'd lost had been paid back in full on the day the charter was repealed. Instead, I asked the council to use the funds to set up a neighborhood emergency fund, something for repairs, support, or legal aid if anything like this ever happened again. They called it the Blake Fund. I didn't argue. The neighborhood changed after that, not in big ways, but steady ones. People talked more, helped more. The fences between yards became less about property lines and more about where the dogs liked to nap. The tension that used to hum beneath every friendly warning or courtesy notice disappeared. One spring afternoon, I came home from the station to find my neighbors rebuilding the old community garden that had been shut down years ago for unauthorized cultivation. Carol was planting tomatoes. Tom was building a bench from old cedar planks. Someone handed me a trowel and pointed to an empty plot. I dropped to one knee and started digging. No one asked for a permit. No one checked for regulation colors, and not a single clipboard was in sight.